All right, Rabbi Silber, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsor for the month of Adar Beis, Leah Sol, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of all those who organize the beautiful, meaningful, and uplifting groundbreaking, and those who devote themselves to the shul day in and day out. I thank our week of learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor for the refuah sheleimah of Aharon Yosef ben Chana Miriam, and the zechus of a zivug for Rivka Rachael bas Batsheva Reena. We also thank our week of learning sponsors, Naftali Baila Langer, as a zechus for refuah sheleimah for Rachael Aster bas Sarah Feyga. We thank our day of learning sponsor, Mrs. Selma Woolf, for refuah sheleimah for Tinok ben Keshet Maya, as well as a refuah for Keshet Maya bas Naomi Gabriella. And we thank our Daf Yomi sponsor for today, the Plunka Family, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Moshe ben David. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, families in nechama, and those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. So we'll say with that, let us begin. We have a very exciting daf. Bless you, a very exciting daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ches. We are picking 8. We are picking up on Zayin Amud Beis, literally the last 3 words. So we'll say, let's just remind ourselves in a general sense about what we're talking about, and then in a specific sense, what we're specifically focusing on over here. In a general sense, we're still hyper-focused on the need for the drasha of Aleha. Namely, again, the Gemara made the Gzeir Shava from the case of Achos Ishto, one's wife's sister, to Yibum, to teach us that just as that halacha l'maisa, one cannot do Yibum with one's wife's sister. So remember, 2 brothers, 2 married, 2 sisters, Reuven and Shimon. Reuven passes away. Shimon now has to do Yibum with his sister-in-law, who also happens to be his wife's sister. Because she is an erva, we learn out from Aleha, or because of Aleha, we learn from there that the halacha l'maisa Yibum does not occur. Yibum does not occur. I will say again, I would venture to say that in the last week of Yevamos, that is the most important piece of information we have learned, because it is that piece of information that is the foundation for everything else, all of the drashas, all of the Mishnah. Now I will say, the fact that we need a drasha to go ahead and exclude Achos Ishto, one's wife's sister, from Yibum, tells us that what? Without that drasha, what would we have thought? That you would do Yibum, which is fascinating because that's an Isser Karis. So now what we've been on the journey with the last 3 days now so far is to try to figure out, why would I have assumed that? Why would I have assumed that aseh doche lo saseh, even in a case of karis? So that's what we were trying to pull out examples. So what we ended up with in yesterday's daf was the fascinating, we switched gears a little bit, and the havamina we wanted to suggest comes from the following concept. And in halacha, we have an idea of hoyo ve'ishtarya. Once something becomes permitted, it becomes wholly permitted. So we'll say, so just the application of that to our cases over here would have been, well, once I say that Yibum is permitted with my brother, with my brother's wife, which in and of itself is an erva, it should permit any other levels of prohibition that may have devolved upon this woman. Once it's permitted, everything is permitted. So the Gemara said, where do we get that concept from? Remember, where do we get that concept from? That was the interesting case, really riveting case, of the Mitzorah, right? The Mitzorah, who on day 8, which is the day that he's supposed to come and offer up his karbanos, and have the blood applications on his thumbs and on his toes, right, has a seminal emission. So remember again, the Gemara said, we allow him to come to Shar Nikanar, even though he's a Tvul Yom. Why? Hoel Ishtarya, since it's permitted for him to come to begin with, even though again he's Mechusar Kippurim, he's lacking fundamental atonement because he hasn't yet brought his karbanos. Once we're going to allow him to come in for the blood applications, so we'll allow him to come in even if he's a Tvul Yom as a Balkari. Right? So the inference from that is, so too we should say, that once you're permitted to do Yibum, which is already a forbidden relationship, i.e. to marry your brother's wife or your brother's widow, so even if this woman is also because of other things, for example, she's also my wife's sister, it should still be permitted as well. Good. That's the Chazara. Says the Gemara, Midami Dula. How can you compare the cases? After all, again, top of Chasam Adaf. So listen to this. So how can you compare the case of Yibum to the case of the Metzora. I'll tell you why. Tinok, this is actually really interesting. Top of Ches. Tinok, heichod nosa meis v'achar kach nosa chai. So, I hear this in the following case. We'll say two brothers, Reuven and Shimon. So let's say for a moment like this. And now, again, we're assuming now they're married to two sisters. So let's say Reuven is the brother that passes away. So I understand if Reuven got married first, right? And then Shimon got married. Both say mace, right? It's not that the dead guy is getting married. It's that ultimately, again, the one who is now deceased, the brother who passed away, is the one who got married first. So if the now deceased brother was the one who got married first, and afterwards the living brother, the surviving brother, got married, I understand how maybe you could say, Hoel the ishtaria. Why? The migo the ishtari isser eshazach, istari nami isser achosisha. Because we'll say, what's unique about that case? In other words, why set it up like that, where the deceased brother got married before the living brother? Because we'll say, what does that do? That solidifies that the nature of Reuven's relationship with Shimon's wife first begins as his brother's wife. Only later on is there an additional layer. After Reuven gets married to his wife, there's now an additional layer. That's what? That Shimon's wife is also his wife's sister. So the Gemara says, I could hear the concept of the ishtari in that kind of case. Since the Isser of Eishes Ach came first, and then again the Isser of Achos Ishto comes later. Then when Reuven passes away, I could hear that since we're going to permit Shimon to marry his brother's widow, which is Eishes Ach, also the Isser of Achos Ishto falls away as well. Ella Nosa Chayvi Achakach Nosa Meis Isser Achos Isha Kadim. So I'll say, but here's the problem. If it's a case where, let's say, Shimon marries his wife first, before Reuven gets married, which means that ultimately, again, I will say that when Reuven gets married, when Shimon gets married first, so we'll say what that means is, Shimon is already usher to his sister-in-law, to his wife's sister, right? That's before anything else happens. He's already usher now to marry his wife's sister. When Reuven now marries his wife, who also happens to be Shimon's wife's sister, so now there's an additional Isra of Eishes Ach. So we'll see, hear what the Gemara is saying. Let me just say this outside for just a moment, because it's actually not confusing. Just remembering the case is confusing. What the Gemara is suggesting is like this. The Gemara wanted to suggest that Yibum, with all our rayas, not all arayas, but even with additional arayas, should be permitted. Based on what principle? Hoil the ishtari ishtaya. But remember again, we keep saying this, I think, every single year. What's the greatest chiddush of Yibum in general? What's the greatest chiddush? Right? That which is an erva becomes mutter. Right? Again, that's out of the Yibum gate. Right? That's already how we're operating. A brother's wife is an erva. So the notion that not only am I permitted, but there's a mitzvah to marry this someone who's an erva is an incredible chiddush. What the Gemara is just simply suggesting is, why don't we just say, once one erva is permitted, then what? All erva should be permitted. That's all, which rather I would say is actually a pretty solid argument. The Gemara is saying, and specifically what we're focusing on is, if it's permitted to marry your brother's widow, it should also be permitted to marry your brother's widow when? Even if she is your wife's sister. To which the Gemara says, well, 1 second. I could buy into that, but I could only buy into that where the Isser Eishes Ach was the first Isser. And then the Isser of Achos Ishto came on later on. Right? It was added later on. When does that happen? First thing I will say, that happens in a case where the surviving brother is ultimately, again, the deceased brother married first, and the surviving brother married second. And remember, the two brothers married two sisters. When that happens, the surviving brother first has the Isser Eishes Ach, and only afterwards is the Isser Achos Ishto added on. So then I could hear that ultimately, once we're going to permit the brother's widow, we could permit Achos Ishto as well. But if the prohibition of Achos Ishto came first, for example, the surviving brother married first, at which case, again, his brother's future wife is already prohibited to him as his wife's sister. How can you say, Hoil v'ishtaria, ishtaria? Va'afilu nasames, nami temach. So we'll say that's all the Gemara is saying. Va'afilu nasames, and even in a case where the deceased brother married first, so we wanted to suggest that in a case like that, halacha lamaisa, the Isra Eshazach preceded the Isra of Achos Ishto. Tenach heicha dinasa meis umeis the achakach nasachai. Really, the case only works is if Rabbi say, listen to this, is if Ruvain marries his wife first, right, and dies before Shimon marries his wife. So Rabbi say, what's the beauty in that? There's no beauty in that, but you understand meaning. But the idea is, in that case, what's happened over here? In that case, the Isser Eshes Ach was permitted even before there was a prohibition of Achos Ishto, because Shimon, the surviving brother, hasn't even married yet. So there was a period of time where the only Isser that Shimon was facing regarding his sister-in-law was Eshes Ach. The Gemara says the Chazile de Beni Beni, because after all, again, she was technically permitted to him in Yibum in between the time of his brother's death and he married his new wife. Ella nosa meis velo meis, but rather, again, listen to this. But if the deceased brother got married and before he died, before he died, nosachai, his brother married his wife. So therefore, I'll say what that means is both brothers are alive and married at the same time. Then what? Lo ichazi leklal. So the Gemara suggesting is, I don't understand. If Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters, and they are both married to their respective wives while both are alive, so the Ramai said that means before Reuven passes away, Shimon, right, when he relates to his sister-in-law, has two prohibitions. What are the two prohibitions? Eshesach and Achos Ishto. If those two prohibitions are in effect before the Yibum obligation occurs, why would we think that Yibum has the ability to set aside both of those prohibitions? Mila Modi Ula. Doesn't Ula agree? She'imra Keri Belel Shmini She'in Machnis Yadav Labahanos Shelo Yotza B'Shah Shirui Lahavi Bakarbon. They both say, watch this. Because doesn't Ula agree in the following case? You both say, let's go back to our Mitzorah. What a great case, the Mitzorah case, right? You have to admit, that was a riveting case. So you both say, remember again, at most, when does the Mitzorah case work? When could we say, Hoel ve'ishtaria ishtari? When could we say that? When he has the seminal emission, when? Day 8. Now what's happened on day 8? Day 8, he's gone through his purification process already. Right? He's already gone through. What's the only thing he's missing on day 8? Right? It's karbanos. Karbanos / blood application. Right? It's the same thing. That's the only thing he's doing. So therefore we say, since he's permitted to come into the Azara, ultimately, again, for his blood applications, we permit him to come in as a tvul yom for his kari emission as well. I will say, but what do we agree? What happens if he has the seminal emission, not day 8, but the night before? Night 8. Would we allow him to come into the Beis HaMikdash on day 8? And the answer, of course, is no. Why? Because at the time that he had his seminal emission, he's not fit to come into the Beis HaMikdash at that time, right? You can't. In other words, he's not allowed to come into the Beis HaMikdash the night of the 8th day, because there's nothing to do on the night of the 8th day. There's no blood application until the day. Were he to have a seminal emission before he had the ability to enter into the actual Beis HaMikdash, even though it's night number 8, we wouldn't say Hol ve'ishtaria. So the Gemara is suggesting the same thing over here. At most, this is fascinating, at most, the only time you could say Hol ve'ishtaria by Yibum, right, by Yibum and by Erva would be when there was a window of time where the only prohibition upon the Yavam was Eshesach. If there was a period of time where all there was Eshesach, right? So the only issue with Yibum was a typical issue, which is his brother's wife. And then another layer was added on later on. Once, technically speaking, he was able to do Yibum, that's enough to say that any other additional layers of prohibition will fall to the side. But if there was never a moment where the only Isser was Eishes Ach, and this Yibum was always complicated by additional Isser factors, you can't say Holove Ishtaria. Or I will say, just to frame it a little bit simpler, because it really is a fascinating idea. The Gemara is entertaining this concept, which is, I think, a very logical concept, which is, once something becomes permitted, it's permitted. It's permitted, and it doesn't really matter how many additional layers of prohibition. What the Gemara just wants to qualify is, I think that concept should only work if there's a moment where only the initial prohibition is in effect. And then other things are added later on. But if from the beginning you have multi-layered prohibitions, who says that at the end of the day all of those prohibitions could fall to the side? So therefore I will say, listen to this, Ella, so therefore I will say we are literally back to square one. Literally back to square one. Ella, ki itzterech aleha. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore again, why do I need the pasuk of aleha? Remember that's the pasuk by Eishes Ach. Sorry, by Achos Ishto, by one's wife's sister. So Hecha dinosames the Achakach nosachai. So we'll see, right? When do I need that case? In the following situation, where the deceased brother marries first, and ultimately, again, the living brother married second. And therefore, I'll say halacha l'maisa. In that case, the Isser Eishes Ach precedes the Isser Achos Ishto. The other possibility is Asya behekisha mid Rabbi Yonah. Ultimately, again, it can be learned out from a hekish based on Rabbi Yonah. What did Rabbi Yonah say? The Amar Rabbi Yonah v'tema Rav Huna b'reid Rabbi Yoshua Amarkra. The pasuk says, "Ki kol asher ye'aseh mikol ha'to'ivos ha'ila v'nichrasu." So you've seen this pasuk before. Pasuk is talking about arayos. Now, both say the beauty of this pasuk is it groups all of the arayos into one pasuk, right? And the Torah says, whoever performs any of these to'evos, any of these abominable acts, v'nichrasu hanefashos ha'osos mikarav amam. Both say, what's the punishment for arayos? What's the punishment for kares? Okay, so we'll say, so the beauty of that pasuk is catch all, all arayos. Now watch this. So hukshu kol ha'arayos kulun le'ishes ach. Now we'll say, now here's what's interesting. All of the arayos are compared ultimately again to Eishes Ach. Right? So everything is compared to Eishes Ach. To the case, right? Because remember, everything is included in that same pasuk. So ma Eishes Ach sharia af kol ha'arayos shayan. So I will say, so the Gemara suggesting is like this. All of the arayos are compared to the prohibition of a brother's wife. So I will say, if that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, why don't we say as follows? Just like Eishes Ach is permitted in Yibum, so to what? All arayos should be permitted. In other words, they both say, all of the arayos are grouped together. And we know Eishes Ach is permitted in Yibum. So why don't we just say, just like Eishes Ach is permitted in Yibum, so too every other erva is permitted in Yibum. And I will say, I do want to point out, when we speak about every other erva, you of course know the Gemara never actually means to go ahead and prohibit. In other words, every other erva never includes every erva. Because remember, again, we're going to see Yibum also only takes place in what? In a permitted marriage. So if my brother marries my mother, right, and then dies, actually that wouldn't work because without children, right? So we'll say, so again, if my brother marries, well, we'll see other examples of this, but Yibum is only going to work in a marriage that was a legal marriage. So when we say all ervas, all arais, we don't literally mean all, we just mean many more than just Eishes Ach. So we'll say, this is a good kasha. So the Gemara says, the Torah links all of the arayas together, so all the arayas are compared to Eishes Ach. So why don't we say, just like Eishes Ach is permitted in Yibum, so too all arayos are permitted in Yibum, to which the Gemara says, Kasav Rachmana Aleha. Oh, listen, this is so nice. This is beautiful. So therefore, again, what does the Torah say? Aleha. But remember again, where is Aleha written? Where is it written? Eishes Ach, Achos Ishto, right? Remember, Aleha is in the pasuk of my wife's sister. And it also appears in the section of Yibum. That's the Gzeir Shava between Allah, Eshet, right, Achos Ishto, and Yibum, to tell me that I can't do Yibum with my wife's sister. That ultimately, again, if my brother and I are both married, right, two brothers married to two sisters, you can't do Yibum in a situation like that. So if I will say that's the need for Allah. So again, I will say we're holding right now. The world is absolutely perfect, right? We're holding right now it's a very simple cheshbon. Right, all of rayas are put together. Right, all of rayas are grouped together, and therefore, ultimately, again, yet Eshes Ach is extracted from that group to tell me that Yibum is permitted. I would have thought just like Eshes Ach is permitted in Yibum, therefore, what? All other rayas are permitted in Yibum. Comes the drasha of Aleha by Achos Ishto, and the drasha teaches me Achos Ishto is not permitted in Yibum. And what do I learn from that? Just like Achos Ishto is not permitted in Yibum, so too what? Every other erva is not permitted in Yibum as well. So it turns out that the only erva permitted in Yibum is the one that the Torah explicitly says, namely, my brother's wife with no other layers of Isser upon her. Incredible. Let's analyze this a little bit. Michti. Kalarayos. Ika la'akshinhu le'eshesach, v'ika la'akshinhu la'achos isha. So I'll say this is great. So now what you're telling me, I will say in the wide world of arayas, right? I have two cases. I have eshes ach and achos ishto. Eshes ach permitted in Yibum, right? Eshes ach is Yibum. Achos ishto prohibited in Yibum. So what we're suggesting now is that Lamaisa we should compare all our rayas to what? To what? Achos Ishto, the case of my wife's sister. And to say just like Achos Ishto, ultimately again is prohibited in arayas, so too all of the cases of arayas are going to be permitted as well. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why? My choz is the akshis la Achos Isha, akshinu le eshes ach. We'll say, why? In other words, I have all of our ayahs grouped together. But so just listen to this for just a moment. I have all of our ayahs grouped together. And I have two cases pulled out of the grouping. What are the two cases? Let's go through this. What are the two cases? Right? Eshesach, my brother's wife, and Achos Ishto, my wife's sister. What's the halacha by Eshesach? Mutter, right? Mitzvah. What's the case by Achos Ishto? Aser. So now the Gemara says, therefore, the step before us, we're going to compare all our ayahs. We're going to compare all our ayahs to the case of Achos Ishto, to teach you that all our ayahs are Asr in Yibum. Why? Why not go ahead and compare all cases to what? To what? Eshesach. And say all our ayahs are mutter. To which the Gemara said, by the way, I think we all agree, I don't know that we've seen so far in this cycle of Daf Yomi another Gemara as exhaustive as this one with the same drasha. Both say it's been the same Gemara since Gimel Amud Beis, and obviously new information coming in. But it's amazing that we're literally clearing the same challenge since Gimel Amud Beis. It's fascinating. So the Gemara says Ibay Sema. So we'll say, so therefore again, why compare all arayas? Why compare all arayas to the case of Achos Ishto? Why not compare them all to the case of Eshes Ach? To which the Gemara says, here we go. I'll tell you why. Ibay Sema L'Kula U'L'Chumra is very similar. We're saying because if we have a choice of comparing all other arayos, ultimately again, in the case of Kula or a case of Chumrah, we're going to compare them l'Chumrah. So if it's a question of comparing all other arayos to Eshes Ach and saying they're permitted, or comparing them to Achos Ishto and saying they're prohibited, what are we going to choose? What are we going to choose? I'm going to choose the Chumrah, right? Which makes absolute sense. L'Chumrah makshina. Iba say the other possibility say is there's a simple reason. Ema hacha trei isuri v'hacha trei isuri. So here's what's fascinating. In the case of Achos Ishto, just like in the case of all other arayas, there are two prohibitions. In the case of Eshes Ach, there's one prohibition. What I'm going to say, play this out. In the case of Achos Ishto, how many prohibitions are upon your brother's widow? Achos Ishto, how many prohibitions? 2. Why? Number 1, right? Eshes Ach. Number 2, Achos Ishto. We'll say, if you think about it, by the way, that's true with every single other arayos, right? Every single other erva has 2 prohibitions, because every erva in this Yibum situation, by definition, will be an Eshes Ach, and by definition will also have whatever other additional layer of erva upon her. The only exception to this rule is Eishes Ach, right? Where she only has one Isser, which is Eishes Ach. By the way, no trick questions by Yevamos. I promise you, right? It's hard enough just to get pshat. This is not like testing your analytical skills over here. Let's say, which is very interesting. Therefore, the Gemara says, Hacha trei Isuri, Vacha trei Isuri. Achos Ishto, right? Wife's sister has two prohibitions, Achos Ishto and Eishes Ach, and every other erva in the erva family also will have two prohibitions upon her in this situation. Her regular erva, whatever her regular erva status is, and Eishes Ach. The Gemara says, utrei mitrei alfinon. Therefore, we'll say it makes sense to learn out a case of two Isurim from a case of two Isurim, which means it makes sense to learn out all other arayas, which have two Isurim when it comes to Yibum, from Achos Ishto, which also has two Isurim. Hacha, but in just the classic case of Eishes Ach, Chada Isura, she only has one Isur, the Isur of Eishes Ach. That's her only prohibition. V'trei michada le'alfina. Therefore, also it doesn't make sense to learn out all other arayas, which have two Isurim, from Eishes Ach, which only has one Isur. Fascinating. So I will say, Rava says, the truth, I will say. So I just want to point out, it's not clear that we've successfully darshaned the Havamina for the Aleha Drasha. So we're pivoting a little bit over here. So Rava says, in reality, Erva lo tzricha kra. De'ina se dochalos ase sheish bokaris. Wow. Rava says, oh, by the way, we actually don't need a pasuk to teach us that Yibum does not allow for an erva. We've just spent a week on this, right? We actually don't need a pasuk to teach me that ultimately you can't do Yibum with a woman who has an additional erva layer, right? An additional erva layer other than Eishes Ach. Why not? I'll say it's very simple. The whole yisod of Yibum is based on the concept of asay docha los asay. The asay of Yibum is docha the los asay of the Isser erva of Eishes Ach. We'll say asay is only docha los asay when the los asay, the lav, is exactly that, just the lav. But if there's an Isser kares, we don't say asay docha los asay. So therefore, we'll say it is obvious, says Rava, that of course you can't do Yibum with an erva. How can you do Yibum with an erva? Yibum, again, the mechanics are asay docha los asay, and asay docha los asay doesn't set aside the los asay when the los asay is punishable by kares. Okay, that was easy. Says the Gemara, so ki tzrich kra, but when do I need the pasuk? L'meisar tzara. See, I will say, the novelty in all of this is not that you can't do Yibum with an erva. That's pretty obvious. The novelty in all of this is that you can't even do Yibum with the co-wife of an erva. Right? That's the chiddush over here. L'meisar tzara. Ultimately, again, to prohibit the co-wife. The Gemara says, "Erva lo tzricha kra." Is that true? That you don't need a pasuk to exclude an erva from Yibum? V'hatanya, but we learned ein li elahi. We'll say, remember again in the drasha of Aleha back on Gimel Amud Beis, we darshaned that the lashon of the Gemara was that from that pasuk, I only know that she, who's the she in this case, Achos Ishto, my wife's sister, is prohibited in Yibum. Mishum, the Gemara says, so we'll say, so the point over here is that the Gemara was making the point that from that pasuk we learn that Achos Ishtar herself is prohibited in Yibum. So we see that we do need a pasuk to teach us that even the erva herself cannot perform Yibum. To which the Gemara says, no, Mishum Tsarasa. That's not what it meant. The Gemara meant that I only need the pasuk to teach me that the tzara, that the co-wife of Achos Ishto, is going to be prohibited in Yibum. The Achos Ishto, the woman herself, my wife's sister, that's obvious I can't do Yibum because we don't say Asay doch lo saseh b'makom kares. I b'hakatani ein li elahein mishum tzaro sehen. But we learned. I'm sorry. B'hakatani ein li elahein. But we learned before. The pasuk seems to indicate that it's excluding the ervas themselves. No, mishum tzaro sehen. It doesn't mean because of them. It means because of their co-wives. So we'll say, so let's analyze a bit more. So we'll say, so therefore Rava's coming along and introducing a totally new stream of thought. And in Rava's model, I don't need a pasuk to teach me that a woman who is an erva is asr in Yibum. Why? Because we'll say any other erva other than Eishes Ach is going to be punishable by kares. And halacha l'maisa, asay is only dochalos asay in the situation where there's not kares. But once there's kares, ultimately we don't say asay dochalos asay. So why the psukim necessary? To exclude the co-wife of an erva from yibum as well. So here we go. So Gemara says, Tashma Rebbe Omer, v'lakach ulekacha, v'yavam, v'yibma, le'esar tsaros, v'arayos. So we'll say, now listen to this. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says, v'lakcholo isha, v'yibma. So we'll say, so the pasuk, just so you understand, the pasuk says, v'yivama yavaleha, ulekacha lo liisha v'yibma. So we'll say, what the pasuk is saying over here, the yavam will go ahead and yavaleh, will come upon her, ulekacha will take her as a wife, v'yibma, and will perform yibam. Now we'll say, what the Gemara is picking up on is as follows. Ulekacha, he will take her, v'yibma, he will perform yibam, are written longhand. If you look at Rashi, ulekacha lo liisha v'yibma, halimatz l'meimar b'lokach isha v'yavein. Could have just said he will take a woman, v'yavein, or the yavala, and he'll do yibam. Why lakcha v'yibma? I will say, whenever the Torah writes a word in a longer form than it needed to, that is usually for what? Drasha purposes. So what's the drasha? Here we go. So the Gemara says, Rebbe Omer, v'lakach, ulakach, could have said v'lakach, but it said v'lakcha. Could have said v'yavein, but it says v'yibma. So what does that come to teach us? Le'esar tsaros v'arayos. So I will say that comes to prohibit co-wives and the arayas themselves. In other words, the arayas, the erva women, and their co-wives. So we'll say, you see from here, according to Rebbe, that you do need a pasuk to teach you an erva, that erva is aser. Ema le'esar tsaros shalrais. No. What Rebbe meant to say is that these psukim, or these extra words, these elongated words, come to teach me that the co-wives of an erva are aser. But the pasuk is bringing down. The part is two psukim, right, or two words. So I will say, if it's only coming to exclude the tsaros of an erva, why do I need two words, two drushas to teach me that? To which the Gemara said, "My love chad la'erva v'chad l'tzara." Isn't it that one is coming to teach me that the erva herself is prohibited from yibum, and the second one is coming to teach that the co-wife of an erva is prohibited from yibum? Lo, idi v'idi l'tzara. No, both are coming to teach me ultimately about the co-wives of an erva. So I'll say, watch this. So why do I need two drushas for co-wives? This is fascinating. Chad l'meisar tzara b'makom mitzvah, v'chad l'mishri tzara shelo b'makom mitzvah. I will say this is fascinating. When is a co-wife aser? I will say, when you say it, it sounds counterintuitive. When is a co-wife of an erva aser? Only when? B'makom mitzvah. But shelo b'makom mitzvah, she's prohibited. Remember we had this case. What does it mean b'makom mitzvah? Makom mitzvah? That's what we're dealing with. That's yibum. Right? So for example, Reuven and Shimon are married to two sisters. Right? Shimon passes away. Right? So Shimon's two wives, right? We'll call them Rachel and Leah, ultimately fall to Reuven to yibum. So Rachel also happens to be Reuven's wife's sister. So what's the halacha? All right, this one we know. What's the halacha? Can't do yibum. What happens to Leah, the co-wife of Rachel? Can't do yibum either. She is the tzara of an erva. So the Gemara suggests, when is the tzara of an erva prohibited? That's ultimately, again, b'makom mitzvah, yibum. I will say, shelo b'makom mitzvah, the tzara of an erva is permitted. Let me give you the example of that. Right? There's Reuven and Zvulun. Reuven and Zvulun are unrelated. Right? Zvulun married Reuven's daughter. I mean, they're related in that Zvulun is Reuven's son-in-law, believing that aside, right? Zvulun marries Reuven's daughter. We'll call them also Rachel and Leah. Rachel is Reuven's daughter. Right? Now what happens? So Zvulun divorces Leah. Is Reuven permitted to marry Leah? Yes. Even though technically speaking, Leah was the co-wife of an erva. She was the co-wife of Rachel, who was Reuven's daughter. See, I will say, the co-wife of an erva only poses a problem b'makom mitzvah, in a yibum situation. But in an unrelated situation, the fact that a man was married to two women, if he divorces one, or for that matter, he dies, the co-wife of an erva has no halachic stigma, we'll say to it, regarding anyone. So therefore, again, in that case over here, where it's not a makom mitzvah, Zvulun divorces Rachel, or for that matter, again, Zvulun dies and there's no yibum. If Ruvain wants to marry Leah, who was the co-wife of Ruvain's daughter, that's permitted. So therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest that Allah Alamaisa, the two drashas are coming to teach me, a tzara is only prohibited by makom mitzvah, but shalom makom mitzvah is totally permitted. Incredible. So my taima, what's the reason? The yavam v'yibma b'makom yibum hu da asira tzara. It's only in the situation of yibum that the co-wife is prohibited. Shalom b'makom yibum shari tzara. But in a non-yibum context, ultimately the co-wife is permitted. Amar Rav Ashi says, Masnisin namideka. The Mishnah seems to support this as well, because the Mishnah says, Chamesh esrei nashim potros tzarosehen. Interestingly enough, and I will say, before we go on, so I just want to point out, just to be clear on this. So the Gemara is saying over here, and this is halacha l'maisa in fact, the concept of a tsaras erva is only a concept in a yibum setting. In other words, the notion that an erva will ultimately exempt her co-wife is a din in yibum. There is no other halachic stigma to being the co-wife of an erva in any other marital situation. So again, that's why I just want to be clear on this case. So again, you have Reuven and Zvulun, and they're totally unrelated. Or we could just keep it simple. I know I'm mixing cases. Reuven and Zvulun, just to keep it simple. Reuven and Zvulun married two sisters, right? Zvulun happens to have an additional wife, right? Who's unrelated to the other two women. So now what happens? So now technically speaking, right? Rachel and Leah, Zvulun's two wives. So Leah is the co-wife of an erva, because Rachel also happens to be Reuven's wife's sister. So I will say, should something happen to Zvulun, right? Zvulun divorces Leah. There's no problem for Reuven to marry Leah, even though, again, Leah was the co-wife of Reuven's sister-in-law. So again, the point over here is there's no tsaras erva situation in a non-yibum setting. Good. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ashi Masnisin Namideka. We have a Mishnah that supports this as well. Diktani Chamesh Esrei Nashim Potros Sarosehen. The pasuk says, now this diak in the Mishnah, we're jumping back for just a moment. How do we get into this? By the way, do you want me to show it to you on the chart, or does it make sense? Yeah? Okay. So I'll say, again, I'm probably complicating it with the cases. It's just a simple idea. The notion of tsaras erva, the koif of an erva, is only a problem in a yibum setting. Any other situation where a woman is the co-wife of an erva doesn't render her ineligible to the man who is not permitted to marry the erva. Simply said. So we'll say, so now remember, all of this is part of a bigger conversation. Rava. Right, we're all about Rava. And what did Rava say? In general, an erva does not need a pasuk. Right? The idea that you can't do yibum with an erva is obvious. Why is it obvious? Because we don't say asay doch lo sasay in the situation of what? Where the lo sasay is punishable by kares. So the Mishnah supports this. Masnisan amidega diktani chamesh esrei nashim potros sarosehen. The pasuk says 15. Going back to our Mishnah, 15 women exempt their co-wives from yibum. Let's say the Mishnah doesn't say that 15 women are exempt from yibum and also exempt their co-wives. Why doesn't the Mishnah say 15 women are exempt from yibum? Because halacha l'maisa, you don't have to say it. Because it's obvious. These 15 women who are all arayas, of course they're exempt from yibum. Because yibum works on the platform of asay doch lo sasay, and asay doch lo sasay only works when there's not a isur kares. So of course these 15 women are exempt from yibum themselves. The chiddush is that they even exempt their co-wives. So the Gemara says, Shmamina. So indeed, see from here that Rav is correct. So why is it that an erva herself doesn't need a pasuk to exempt her from yibum? Because ultimately, again, an asay is not docha lo saseh when the lo saseh is punishable by kares. Well, tsaranami lo tibaikra de'ein asay docha lo saseh sheyesh bo kares. So we'll say, now listen to this. Remember, we'll say, where do we learn the concept of tsara from? Co-wives? Because the Torah uses the lashon of litzrar. Now we'll say, bipashtos, litzrar means the co-wife is bound to what we'll call the primary wife. Right? The co-wife is bound to the erva wife. Well, if the co-wife is bound to the Erev wife, I will say whatever is true for the goose is true for the gander, right? Whatever is true for the Erva is automatically true for the tzara, for the co-wife. If that's the case, then the same way I don't need a pasuk to exempt an erva from yibum, I also shouldn't need a pasuk to do what? Exempt the tzara of an erva. Exempt the tzara, the co-wife of an erva as well. Both say Rashi points out over here, look at Rashi. Tzar nameloti boy aleh kra l'drasha de'ena say dechalos say sheish bakaris diksiv litzrar dimashma lo achos ishtavalo tzarasa. But remember again, the litzrar tells me whatever is the status of the erva is the status of her co-wife. So therefore, I shouldn't need a pasuk for co-wife either. Amarli Rav Acha bar Bibi. Amarli Rav Acha bar Bibi. Mar l'Ravina. Hachi kamer mishmei derava. Tzara nami lo itztirich kra. You're right. The truth is, a tzara really doesn't need a pasuk as well. Because once you're telling me that Allah l'maisa, the erva doesn't need a pasuk. The tzara, who is bound to the erva, ultimately doesn't need a pasuk either. So where's the pasuk? Kistirich kra. Vasei amad beis lemishrei tzar shelo b'makom mitzvah. You're right, says the Gemara. The truth is, where is the pasuk really needed? Rabbi said the pasuk is needed not to aser, the pasuk is needed to permit. To permit what? Saras erva shelo b'makom mitzvah. Rabbi said that the co-wife of an erva is permitted in a non-mitzvah context. Again, Rabbi said two men unrelated to each other. One of Shimon's wives is an erva to Reuven, but the men are unrelated. Right? Shimon divorces his wives for argument's sake. Reuven is permitted to marry the woman who is not an erva to him. He's permitted to do that. Right? Why? Because halacha l'maisa, the issue of tzaras erva, only poses a problem in a yibum context. That's when the erva endows her status to the co-wife. But in a non-mitzvah setting, being the co-wife of an erva has absolutely no halachic impact on the permitted woman. Incredible. So my time, what's the reason? Amar kra aleha b'makom aleha hu da'asira shelo b'makom aleha sharia. Because of us, we do the aleha. It says aleha by achos ishto. It says aleha ultimately again by yibum. It's only b'makom aleha. It's only in the case of yibum. B'makom mitzvah, that being the co-wife of an erva endows the tzara with the erva status. But shelo b'makom mitzvah, being the co-wife of an erva, has no halachic implication. Amar li Bar Chama l'Rava, Eima erva gufei shelo b'makom mitzvah tishtari. Well, maybe. Okay, so let's say based on this, the Gemara floats a wild suggestion. Maybe an erva herself, shelo b'makom mitzvah, should also be permitted. Whereas maybe an erva is only prohibited b'makom mitzvah in a yibum context, but in a non-yibum context, perhaps again the erva should be permitted, which also has a pretty wild assertion. V'lav kal v'chomer. The Gemara says, come on, right? That's a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara says, b'makom mitzvah asira shelo b'makom mitzvah sharia. Rabbi say if an erva is aser when b'makom mitzvah, if even b'makom mitzvah an erva is going to be aser, then doesn't it go without saying that shelo b'makom mitzvah an erva is going to be aser? To which the Gemara says, Amrale Tzara Tochiach. No, because in fact we just learned just the opposite. Look at the case of the co-wife. De b'makom mitzvah asira, v'shelo b'makom mitzvah sharia. Also remember again, no, we just learned the opposite. Right, the tzara, the co-wife. Co-wife is only prohibited when? In a situation of yibum, b'makom mitzvah. Shelo b'makom mitzvah, being the co-wife of an erva, has absolutely no impact upon you. To which the Gemara says, Amrale alech amakra b'chayeha. So I'll say, so that's where the pasuk says that when is a wife's sister prohibited? Bechayeha, as long as the wife is still alive. So I'll say, which tells you that the Isser Erva is always in existence. Right? An Isser Erva is always in existence. Even Shelo b'makom mitzvah. And Achos Ishto is the example of this. I will say, when is my wife's sister prohibited to me? When is she prohibited to me? Now, again, it does have a shelf life. In other words, wife's sister is only prohibited as long as the wife is alive, right? Once the wife passes away, there's no longer a prohibition of achos ishto. But lamaisa, what I see from here, as long as my wife is alive, her sister is prohibited, which tells you that the isra applies b'makom mitzvah and shelo b'makom mitzvah. So you must, 1 second. Hi b'chayeha, why you can't use that? You can't use that b'chayeha, Because Bechayeha comes to teach me something different. What does it come to teach me? So, Hai Bechayeha mi boile lemeute la'achar misa. 1 second, I will say. The Bechayeha by Achos Ishto, by my sister's wife, comes to teach me a different halacha, which is the prohibition of Achos Ishto only applies when my wife is alive. But the moment the wife passes away, her sister becomes permitted. To which the Gemara says, Hahi mevi isha al achos son nafka. No. We learned that out from the pasuk of where it says, and to a woman and her sister, lo sikach. Isha al achosa, lo sikach. You cannot go ahead and take them. Lo sikach litzrar. So the Gemara says, what that means is, the prohibition of achos ishto is only when you want to take your wife's sister in addition to who? In addition to your wife. Meaning your wife is still there. Hava amina niskarsha sharia. 1 second, if it's based on that, I might have thought that what? If I'm married to my wife and then I divorce my wife, based on that, it should be permitted to what? Marry her sister. Tamul lower bechayah. Therefore, the pasuk says, no, the prohibition of achos ishto, is actually interesting halacha. The prohibition of achos ishto applies as long as my wife is alive, even if what? We're not married. Right? Kol shebechayeha. Da'af agab diniskar shalo. Halacha l'maisa, as long as my wife is alive, even if we're not married, the prohibition of achos ishto still applies. Ela amur Rav Huna bar Tachlifa mishmei derava. Trei kroi ksivi. There are two psukim. What's the word of two psukim? Ksiv isha lachos l'sikach litzra. The pasuk says, a woman to write Isha lachos l'sika, you cannot go ahead and take a woman and her sister. Uksiv legalos ervasa. And the pasuk says to uncover her nakedness. So we'll say, now this is the same pasuk, by the way. The pasuk reads, Isha lachos l'sikach litzrar legalos ervasa. So the pasuk says, you shall not marry a woman and her sister, lo sikach, to take them in marriage, litzrar, to make them co-wives. And then the end of the pasuk says, legalos ervasa, to uncover nakedness. So why do you need those two phrases? To which the Gemara says, lo sikach, legalos ervasa dechadamash. I both say, here's what's interesting. The Gemara is saying interesting there. Number one, why do you need two? Number two, the first part of the phrase, lo sikach litzrar is plural. You can't take them as co-wives. Legalos ervasa, to uncover her nakedness, is singular. So who is the pasuk talking about? Okay, so here we go. B'makom mitzvah shtehen asuros. I will say ultimately again, b'makom mitzvah, both of them will be aser. Both of them will be aser. I will say ultimately again, meaning what? B'makom mitzvah being yibum, both will be aser. Shelo b'makom mitzvah. But I will say when it's not b'makom mitzvah, hi asura. Again, I will say ultimately she will be prohibited. Namely, again, my wife's sister will be prohibited. Vitzaras mutaras, but her co-wife will be permitted. I could switch that around and I could say b'makom mitzvah hi asura vitzaras mutaras shelo b'makom mitzvah shtein asuras. We'll say, why don't I say like this? Maybe b'makom mitzvah. Ultimately, what? I could say that my wife's sister will be prohibited, but her co-wife will be permitted. Shelo b'makom mitzvah. Maybe they're both aser. Imkein lo yomer aleha. If that's the case, the pasuk says, don't do the drasha, don't go and say the word aleha. Okay? How do you know that Allah is coming to teach me an isser? Dilma lehetera. Maybe he's coming to teach me a het. This is what it means to say. Isha alachosa lo sikach litzrar. The pasuk says, do not take a woman and her sister litzrar. Lo hi velo tsarasa. So we'll say ultimately again, neither he nor her co-wife. Shelo b'makom aleha. Aval b'makom aleha. So we'll say when is achos ishto aser? Perhaps again in a situation of yibum, and that issue devolves upon the wife's sister and her co-wife. Aval b'makom aleha. In the case of that, we'll say aleha means yibum shtehen mutaros. Maybe both the sister-in-law and her wife and her co-wife are going to be mutter. Imkein legalos erva dechad dehechin mishkachas. If that's the case, then when is the case where one of them would be prohibited? Iba makom mitzvah shtei mutaros. If it's makom mitzvah, both of them are much like we just said. Ishalo makom mitzvah, and if it's not a makom mitzvah, shtein asuros. Then ultimately, again, both of them will be asur. Stay for Rabosai. Remember, let's just frame this in the right way. All of this entire Gemara, what this will stop over here for today, but all of this was based on the shita of Rava. What did Rava want to suggest? Rava wanted to say that erva doesn't need a pasuk. Right? So in other words, or say differently, to exclude an erva from yibum doesn't require a pasuk. Why doesn't an erva require an exclusionary verse? Why not? Why not? Because yibum is based on what halachic premise? What halachic premise? Asya say v'dochelosa say, and an asay is only dochelosa say when? When we'll call it a lav. But if it's an isser kares, ultimately again asay is not dochelosa say. Therefore, again says Rava, any case of erva doesn't really require a pasuk. So why do the psukim come? Why do the psukim come? Ultimately, to exclude who? Saras erva. To exclude saras erva. And Abba said, quite possibly, if we further that drush a little bit more, to exclude the idea that saras erva is only going to be prohibited when? When? B'makom mitzvah in a yibum context. But shelo b'makom mitzvah, saras erva, the koif of an erva, ultimately again will be permissible. So we'll stop over here for today. We're going to continue with the sugya Meretz Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach.